Welcome to Policy Matters. Our goal is to keep you informed on the upcoming election, how it affects you, and why it matters. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Merrifield-Wilson. The first and only vice presidential debate took place a week ago today. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance went head-to-head on the nation's most pressing issues. I want to highlight the top three clashes of the debate. Starting off, J.D. Vance fact-checked the fact-checkers, resulting in a muted mic. Let's take a look.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut. We have so much we want to get to. Thank you for explaining the legal process. Nora.
Thank you, Margaret.
Walz was then asked to correct on whether he was in China for the Tiananmen Square protests.
The things that I think are the values that people care about.
Governor, just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this is I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests, went in.
The two candidates then battled over abortion laws, one of the most controversial topics to be discussed.
Trying to distort the way a law is written to try and make a point, that's not it at all.
What was I wrong about, Governor? Please tell me, what was I wrong about?
That is not the way the law is written. Look, I've given
But how?
I've given this advice on a lot of things, that getting involved, that's been misread, and it was fact-checked at the last debate. But the point on this is there's a continuation of these guys to try and tell women or to get involved. I use this line on this, just mind your own business on this. Things worked best when Roe versus Wade was in place. When we do a restoration of Roe, that works best. That doesn't preclude us from increasing funding for children. It doesn't increase us from making sure that once that child's born, like in Minnesota, they get meals, they get early childhood education, they get health care. So the hiding behind we're going to do all these other things when you're not proposing them in your budget. Kamala Harris is proposing them. She's proposing all those things to make life easier for families.
I asked a specific question, Governor. You gave me a slogan as a response.
It's not the case. It's not true. That's not what the law says. So they fact-checked it with President Trump.
California Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed legislation that would have imposed new safety regulations on AI while signing a different bill focused on AI transparency last week. Senate Bill 1047 included new safety requirements for developers of large-scale AI models. Also known as the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act, this bill would have required AI developers to include full shutdown capabilities and to comply with defined safety and security protocols to prevent AI from harming critical infrastructure. Newsom said that while he agreed safety protocols should be adopted, these stringent standards generalize the use of AI without taking account the context in which it was used. These measures would have only applied to the large-scale models, which Newsom further argued could have misled the public into a false sense of security and protection that would have not been actually used with all AI generative modeling systems. Assembly Bill 2013 did pass the state legislature and was signed by Governor Newsom. This law will impose more transparency in AI. It requires developers to disclose on its website a summary of the data used in the creation of the AI technology or service. State legislators across the country have become more involved in the regulation of artificial intelligence. The Software Alliance, an advocacy firm for the software industry, noted that in this past year, state legislators introduced a total of 407 bills related to AI. This reflects a national interest in regulation of the diffusion of technology, especially as it applies to campaigns and elections. Indiana's Governor Eric Holcomb signed Senate Bill 1050 into law earlier in March of this year. It created an AI task force which began meeting in July. The task force aims to understand the use of AI in state agencies. Indiana is also one of 20 states that has laws requiring the campaign messages using deepfake images, video, or audio to include disclosures. U.S. Senator Mike Braun, who's currently running for governor of Indiana, sponsored a TV advertisement with his opponent, Democratic Jennifer McCormick, in front of supporters, proudly posing with signs proclaiming no gas stoves. The image was doctored, but did not include the required disclosure informing viewers that it was digitally altered. Political reporter Adam Wren first broke the story last week, the day before the first gubernatorial debate on CBS for Fox 59. As Wren noted, it's not clear whether AI was used, but the image was fake and still violated the law. It was the first of a $1 million ad buy, which could be significant in this race. A lot of citizens don't really know what the duties of president and vice president are. The Vice President of the United States serves as the second highest executive officer and has a multifaceted role. Primarily, the Vice President is the President of the Senate, casting tie-breaking votes when necessary. In addition to legislative duties, the Vice President is often the key advisor to the President and may represent the administration in diplomatic functions. Historically, the role of the Vice President has evolved significantly. The position was established in 1789 with John Adams as the first Vice President under George Washington. Initially, the Vice President's responsibilities were limited, often serving in a largely ceremonial capacity. This has changed, though, over time, especially as the responsibilities of the presidency have grown. In the 20th century, Vice Presidents like Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson began to take on more significant roles, influencing policy and domestic issues. Today, Vice Presidents are heavily involved in governance, often taking on major initiatives and serving as key representatives for the administration, reflecting the evolving expectations of this important office. We'll be back right after this with an interview with Dr. Thakar and my student Levi Alt.
In the heart of Indianapolis, our main mission is to keep you informed, bringing you local and national news. With the upcoming presidential election, there's no better time than now to tune in. But the most important part is you. This is UND-TV News.
I'm now joined by political science student Levi Alt and Dr. Thakar, an international relations professor here at the University of Indianapolis.
Thank you so much, Professor, for coming on and being here today. We're going to have a great conversation. I want to get right into it here. We only have 18 minutes. One of the most salient issues right now in the presidential election is the war in Gaza and with Israel and the Israeli conflict at large. Could you maybe provide just maybe a brief overview of how this conflict happened? I know October 7th is pretty much established as Hamas fired rockets into Israel. Maybe give us some context to that.
Hamas mounted a surprise attack on Israel on October 7th last year and killed a large number of people, kidnapped a large number of hostages and took them. And Hamas was likely reacting to Saudi Arabia's overture to Israel, the possibility of normalizing relations, and they were trying to stall it, which they did successfully. This invited a very fierce reprisal from Israel, which has resulted as of now in about 40,000 people being killed by Israeli strikes or action in Gaza. Gaza is a southern little strip just south between Israel and Egypt, where about 2 million Palestinians live. But the war has now broadened because Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militant group, quasi-government in Lebanon to the north of Israel, had been firing some rockets into Israel as a show of sympathy and solidarity with the Gazans. And so Israel reacted by doing three things. One, it got these pagers, which many Hezbollah leaders had, to explode. It's a fairly long-winded action, calls for a lot of meticulous planning. It's being considered one of those great strikes. Secondly, it managed to kill the leader of Hezbollah, and they got him in a strike. And thirdly, Israel then went ahead and advanced into Lebanon and is carrying out daily strikes on the Hezbollah occupied parts of Beirut and other areas. So this is looking more and more like a Middle East war, considering that Iran has been involved. Iran fired rockets into Israel because Hezbollah is supported by Iran. And there's been Israeli strikes against Yemen as well. So now it's like 5 countries involved.
Could you talk a little bit about how our country has responded to this? I know we're celebrating essentially, or commemorating, I should say, a year of engagement and interaction. What has the United States response been?
Nothing. This is kind of sad. The United States has not done very much because it has chosen to subcontract its Middle East policy right now to Israel. It has supported Israel, but it hasn't really done much. And in the absence of any push from the United States, the current Israeli Prime Minister, note, I'm not saying government, I'm saying Prime Minister, the current Israeli Prime Minister seems to have no interest in cooling of the war, because as long as there's a war scare going on, he's safe from possible impeachment within his own country. And there seems to be a friction and a fracture amongst Democrats in this country about how this should be dealt with. A lot of Democratic leaders are upset over the fact that the Biden administration has not done more to rein in Israel.
Now, how has Biden and Harris, or how has Harris differentiated her policies compared to Biden? Is there any actual substance to their disagreement? Is there disagreement? And to what degree do you think it'll matter at all?
Vice presidents who are running for election are not able to go ahead and run down the president whose administration they have been part of. That said, vice presidents have also not played a very big role in any administration. Harris, for example, was delegated to doing border duties and a few other issues. She spoke about abortion, but on foreign policy, the only sense we have that she differs from Biden is that she went ahead and said in the debate that she wanted to see peace and an end to the war. Rather than we stand with Israel and let Israel do what they need to, she went ahead and called for a swift end to the war, which is something the Israelis don't want right now, at least the Israeli government. So that shows that she differs, but she has not made any meaningful difference. Even her vice presidential candidate started his debate by talking about America's continued support for Israel. So there's not much difference there.
Now, do you think when we're looking at the election cycle, if the Republicans take the Senate, and if they maintain the House, we'll have divided government potentially depending on who's in the White House, but how would a Republican administration approach Israel and the Middle East conflict differently? Would there be, to Levi's point, a substantive difference or a change in terms of how our government is involved?
The past Republican administration of President Trump was much more supportive of Israel. Specifically, he made a move to change the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is contested territory. That's why no US administration before this had the embassy there, but Trump did that. The second thing is that there was a pact that President Obama had built with Iran about freezing its nuclear status in exchange for some consumer technology and other things, and that went away. Trump walked out of that one. And so I expect a future Republican administration to try and do that, or failing that, to try and stop a Democratic president from making any headway with Iran or putting the brakes on Israel.
So you think, go ahead, Professor.
Oh, I was just going to add, so do you think like if we do have divided government with a Democratic president but Republican-controlled Congress, sounds like a lot of legislative gridlock with regards to foreign affairs here?
Yes, but then what would happen is likely that the Democratic president would exercise the authority to carry out an executive agreement, much the kind that the JCPO deal, which is the formal name of the deal with Iran that took place in 2015 under Obama. That was an executive agreement, which is why it could be done away with as soon as President Trump came into office. I expect that whoever is the president, if Kamala Harris becomes president, then she'll try and do something like that.
And so
she has the leeway.
And so you don't think a Republican president will try to pursue an agreement like the JCP or whatever it might be called with Iran?
No, it seems fairly evident that's not going to happen, because the current presidential nominee from the Republican side is President Trump, and he walked out of the deal earlier. He also is notoriously hardline on Iran, and so I don't think he's going to do anything out there.
Well, it's interesting. So we're talking about Donald Trump, and he has served as president before, because we have the issue with Ukraine and Russia as well. So another foreign affairs issue. I feel like it's been eclipsed a little bit in terms of public opinion by the Middle East. Right. But where do we stand internationally with regards to this? And could you address how our country has been involved and how that involvement has changed since Ukraine was invaded by Russia at this point several years ago?
The United States has had a policy of encouraging Eastern European countries and also those that were part of the former Soviet Union to look westward. And the Ukraine saw some encouragement at one point of time, which led to a pro-Western government coming to power something like 15, 16 years ago. In 2014, Russia, taking note of this, advanced and took over the Crimea, a region that had been given by Russia to Ukraine 60 years ago, but is contested. But it was a slap to Ukraine. Nothing much happened of it. but relations were tense. Now when there were noises that Ukraine wanted to join NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military defensive alliance built against the Soviet Union and now Russia, the Ukrainians wanted to join this to preserve their security forever. Russia took umbrage, and when negotiations broke down, the Russians opted to go to war rather than have a stalemate or kick the can down the road. There were talks about, we won't raise this question for 20 years. Would you be satisfied with that? And the Russians said no. With the war as it stands, the United States has given certain help, but it can't give too much because Russia might treat that as an act of war, like giving first-ranked military aircraft such as the F-35 Lightning or the F-22 Raptor, or American tanks, the Abrams tanks. But there's been a lot of money funneled through Europe, which gets them European weapons. What's the problem that has been seen now is that Republicans have been, over the last 2 years, in response to prodding by President Trump, they have tried to halt this flow of aid. And this has resulted in aid reaching Ukraine slower, and Ukraine is in some sorts of trouble now. Were a Republican president to take over, and knowing who it is, Donald Trump would probably do what he promised on election in the debate, saying that he would end the war in 6 hours. The only way it could end that quickly is if Ukraine was forced to surrender, which they don't want to do. I don't think it would happen that quickly anyway. It would take a longer time to effect a surrender, but that is probably one way. He has shown tendencies to be more supportive of Russia and also of the dictator in Putin. So I think that's probably what would likely happen. Now, there's still European aid, but the Europeans don't have sufficient aid or have not marshaled their sources together and are also very concerned about a potential Russian strike on them.
So that was my question. There's no doubt that the U.S. president plays a huge role in foreign affairs, specifically with this affair as well. But even outside of the president, like if Trump were to come to power and try to force Ukraine to surrender some of its territory, it doesn't have to just because the U.S. president says so. I'm sure its European allies would come to Ukraine's defense and say, you ought not to give up your territory. So would Ukraine automatically have to concede its territory?
No, but it starts losing. Yeah. I mean, one of the things is they need things like artillery shells, guns, the grease that takes care of the weaponry and the machinery, drones, which have proved to be very effective from the Ukrainians. And if they don't get them in not just continuous supply, but quick supply, then they will start losing territory more and more. So I don't think that they'll surrender, but they might agree to terms.
In effect, it would force, or at least damage the ability for Ukrainians to counter the offensive.
I think that's a good
point. So in effect, it would be.
Right.
Now, so we're talking about Donald Trump, who's already served as president, and what he said he'd do with regards to Ukraine. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the role the vice president plays, even though a lot of times people don't know them as well as the president. So if Kamala Harris was elected as president, do you see her continuing on what President Biden has done, or has she been able to be involved in terms of international affairs and Ukraine specifically as vice president? What would we forecast to see if she was elected from a Harris administration?
I think you'll find more of the same. On this issue, Ukraine, the Democratic Party is pretty much united. On the issue of Gaza, there's some divisions over supporting Israel versus supporting the Arabs, whether they are Gazan Palestinian or they are Lebanese Arabs. But on the issue of Ukraine, the Democratic Party is pretty much united. So she would continue the policy of applying pressure to Russia. It also depends on what situation, what is she handed? We always forget that the president of the United States does not have carte blanche to carry on a war, no blank check. What's likely to happen is if she gets a Congress that is Democrat majority, then that changes the equation. She's able to then do more things. Otherwise, executive orders limit what can be done and are always reversible.
So another question in regards to Ukraine. I know Trump has stated that that Biden's policies, and the result of Biden being president, that he blames Biden for both the Ukrainian invasion and the Israeli conflict. Is there any substance to that, or is there, what maybe could we point to? Would we see a different outcome if Trump was president? I know that's such a hard question to answer because there's so many omitted variables, but is there any truth to the matter, or is there any?
President Trump is not known for being very truthful about a lot of things. He's used a lot of hyperbole. And in this case, the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine was, the Biden administration could have probably done something long back, but that means any American administration, and said that it will not entertain Ukraine coming into NATO. That might have reassured the Russians. The second thing it could have done goes to the other end, and to say that the US will arm Ukraine, and if Ukraine is invaded, then the US would regard that as a call to war, and that's a bit too much. No one would want to do that for a country that is not a bona fide NATO ally. It is not a member of NATO, so it's not covered by the NATO umbrella. Would President Trump have done something different? It's conjecture, but I don't think President Trump would have stopped Putin. He might have tried to get something out of it, but it would have endangered not just American security, but Western security as a whole. American security by association. And so that's the danger. On Israel, the United States would probably have given even more unqualified support, though I don't think it makes a difference. The outcome was never in doubt. Israel defeating Hamas, or at least killing sufficient numbers of people, was never in doubt, or in the case of Lebanon. So the only thing is maybe limited strikes by the US on Iran, which would only increase and the theater of war.
Yeah.
You've helped clarify a lot of, I think, complications with regards to foreign affairs. And I know one of the things that I study in American politics is the fact that elites can really influence how Americans feel about foreign affairs, because quite frankly, we don't know a lot. Do you think that there are ways to help Americans better understand not just what's going on in terms of foreign affairs, but what would you recommend to a viewer watching that says, you're right, I don't know a lot about international relations, but I should, I want to. What kind of guidance or suggestions would you give them?
There are programs in the news that specifically look at these things. So the odd issue of Dateline or Frontline, there's a very good one on CNN. Well, some qualifications, but Fareed Zakaria's Global Public Square is on every Sunday at 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. It's a great show for educating yourself. And then, of course, anyone who hears on the university campus, don't hesitate to take a class in International Relations 101. We talk about this sort of stuff all the time, but I think most Americans should educate themselves by going to PBS. There's very good stuff in the morning. Stephen Skeep mentions these in his morning show. The BBC has a very good international segment in the morning. There are other shows out there. So educate yourself on these issues, and then you have a better handle on how to evaluate your leaders.
And Professor, in our closing, why should students care about international affairs? I know there's a large sentiment of people saying, the U.S. shouldn't be involved, we should mind our own business. What would you say to a voter of, why we should or ought to not be involved, and why does it matter to a college student?
The current world was shaped and built, its architecture was built by the United States in the years post-1945. The Soviet Union was surrounded by military alliances like NATO, SEATO, CENTO, ANZUS, and the like, to bolster global and therefore American security. So if we start isolating ourselves, and by we I mean the United States, then we are walking away from our own creation. And guess what? China is only too happy to fill in the gap. We are in a global superpower competition, and that's something that we need to be aware of.
Dr. Thakar, I want to thank you for joining us here today. Very helpful and a tremendous perspective.
Always happy to talk international relations.
Thank you. Before we end today's episode, I want to remind you that early voting starts today. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. We look forward to keeping you informed on all things politics. We're your hosts, Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson
and Levi Alt.
See you next time on Policy Matters.